The old farmhouse stood on the edge of the countryside, its wooden beams weathered by time, and its walls holding the whispers of generations. For me, Eleanor, it was more than a home. It was a testament to the life I had built with Thomas. A life that, over the years, had grown quiet and distant. I moved through the house with a quiet grace, my days filled with routine and the soft hum of solitude. My marriage to Thomas, once vibrant and full of promise, had settled into a comfortable but emotionally barren existence. We coexisted, respected each other's space, but the spark that had once ignited our love had long since faded. Thomas, a man of the land, spent his days tending to the fields, his hands calloused from years of labor, his gaze often fixed on the horizon rather than on me. Our conversations were brief, our interactions polite, but devoid of the warmth that once defined us. I had grown accustomed to the silence, but it weighed heavily on my heart. There were moments when I longed for the connection we once shared, for the laughter and the shared dreams that had filled our early years. But those moments were fleeting, buried beneath the weight of time and routine. Then came the news of Lucas's arrival. Thomas's nephew, a young man I had only met briefly at family gatherings, was coming to stay for the summer. Lucas was in his early 20s, full of energy and curiosity, and his presence promised to bring a change to the quiet farmhouse. I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Part of me welcomed the idea of company, while another part feared the disruption of my carefully maintained routine. When Lucas arrived, he stepped out of his car with a backpack slung over his shoulder and a smile that seemed to light up the dusty driveway. He greeted Thomas with a firm handshake and then turned to me, his eyes warm and inviting. "It's so good to see you again, Aunt Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying a genuine kindness that made my heart flutter. Unexpectedly, the first few days were filled with activity. Lucas was eager to help, assisting Thomas with the farm chores and offering to help me in the garden. His youthful energy was infectious, and for the first time in years, the farmhouse felt alive. I found myself looking forward to his company, to the way he listened to my stories with genuine interest, to the way his laughter filled the quiet spaces. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice a shift in my feelings. I found myself drawn to Lucas in ways I hadn't anticipated. His easy smile, the way he looked at me with such warmth, the casual brush of his hand against mine, it all stirred something deep within me, something I had thought long buried. I tried to dismiss these feelings, to rationalize them as simple affection for a kind young man, but the pull was undeniable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lucas and I found ourselves alone on the porch. Thomas had retired early, leaving us to enjoy the cool evening air. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of crickets filling the night. "Aunt Eleanor," Lucas began, his voice soft but steady, "I feel like I can talk to you about anything. You're so easy to be around." I smiled, my heart skipping a beat. "You can always talk to me, Lucas. I'm here for you." He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. I think I have feelings for you, more than just family." My breath caught in my throat. I had felt it too, the unspoken connection between us, but hearing him say it aloud made it real. I reached out and gently touched his face, my fingers trembling. "Lucas," I whispered, "I feel it too. But this is complicated." He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. It was a moment of pure vulnerability, a confession of feelings that had been building for weeks. When we pulled away, my heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. "We can't do this," I said, my voice barely audible. "It's wrong, Lucas. You're young and I'm your aunt. But we're not blood related," he argued, his voice filled with passion. "Does that make a difference?" I hesitated. The absence of a blood tie did change things, but it didn't erase the moral complexities of our situation. I cared deeply for Lucas, but I also knew the potential consequences of our actions. The guilt weighed heavily on me, but so did the longing in my heart. The days after Lucas's confession were a whirlwind of emotions. I try to go about my usual routine, tending to the garden, preparing meals, keeping the farmhouse in order, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time I saw him, my heart would skip a beat. His presence was like a magnet, pulling me in directions I knew I shouldn't go. I told myself it was just a fleeting feeling, something that would pass with time, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was as if a part of me that had been dormant for years had suddenly awakened, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. Lucas, too, seemed to be struggling. He threw himself into his work on the farm, helping Thomas with the harvest and repairing the old barn. But there were moments when our eyes would meet, and I could see the conflict in his gaze. It mirrored my own, a mix of longing, guilt, and uncertainty. We didn't talk about what had happened on the porch, but it hung between us like an unspoken truth, impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as we worked together in the garden, Lucas broke the silence. "Aunt Eleanor," he said, his voice hesitant, "I've been thinking about what I said. I don't want to make things difficult for you. I needed you to know how I feel." I paused, my hands stilling in the soil. I looked up at him, my heart aching with the weight of his words. "Lucas," I said softly, "I care about you too. More than I should. But we have to be careful. This isn't simple." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know. And I don't want to hurt anyone. Especially not you." The sincerity in his voice touched me deeply. I reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort and understanding. "We'll figure this out," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure how. As the days passed, we found ourselves drawn together more and more. We would take long walks through the fields, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his life in the city, about his studies, about his dreams for the future. I shared stories of my childhood, of the early years of my marriage to Thomas, of the joys and sorrows that had shaped my life. With each passing day, the bond between us grew stronger, more intricate, more impossible to ignore, but the guilt never fully left me. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what we were doing. I thought about Thomas, about the life we had built together, about the promises we had made. I thought about Lucas, about his youth, his future, and the potential consequences of our actions. The weight of it all was almost too much to bear. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Lucas and I found ourselves on the porch once again. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the world seemed to hold its breath. We sat in silence for a while, the unspoken tension between us palpable. Finally, Lucas spoke. "Aunt Eleanor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know what to do. I don't want to lose you, but I don't want to ruin everything either." I turned to him, my heart breaking at the vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't know either, Lucas," I admitted. "But I do know that we can't keep going like this. It's not fair to anyone. Not to you, not to Thomas, not to me." He nodded, his expression pained. "I know, but how do we stop? How do we just walk away from this?" I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I didn't want to walk away. Despite the guilt, despite the moral complexities, I didn't want to let go of the connection we had found. It was selfish, I knew, but it was also real. And that made it all the more difficult. As the summer drew to a close, Lucas's departure loomed on the horizon. The thought of him leaving filled me with a sense of dread. I had grown so used to his presence, to the way he made me feel alive again, that the idea of returning to my quiet, solitary life was almost unbearable. On his last night at the farmhouse, we sat together on the porch, just as we had so many times before. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of everything we couldn't say. Finally, Lucas turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Aunt Eleanor," he said, his voice steady, "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I'll never forget this summer. I'll never forget you." Tears welled up in my eyes as I reached out and took his hand. "I'll never forget you either, Lucas," I whispered. "No matter what happens, you'll always have a place in my heart." We sat there for a long time, holding hands and watching the stars. It was a bittersweet moment, filled with the knowledge that our time together was coming to an end. But it was also a moment of clarity, of acceptance. We had found something beautiful and rare, something that had changed us both in ways we couldn't fully understand. And even though we couldn't be together, I knew that I would carry the memory of this summer with me for the rest of my life. When Lucas left the next morning, I stood on the porch and watched as his car disappeared down the dusty driveway. The farmhouse felt emptier than ever, the silence more pronounced. I returned to my routine, but I was changed. The summer had awakened something within me, a longing I had thought long buried. The moral dilemma remained unresolved, a constant presence in my heart. I knew our relationship was wrong, but the memory of our stolen moments lingered, a bittersweet reminder of what could never be. The farmhouse stood as it always had, a silent witness to the secrets it held. The whispers of that summer would forever echo in its halls, a testament to the forbidden love that had briefly bloomed within its walls. After Lucas left, the farm felt quieter than ever. Even the sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, seemed muted, as if the world around me had lost some of its color. I tried to return to my routine, to the familiar rhythm of life on the farm, but everything felt different. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a shell, empty and hollow without his presence. Thomas, as always, was absorbed in his work. He didn't seem to notice the change in me, the way I moved through the days with a heaviness in my chest. He was a man of few words, and our conversations remained brief and practical. I wondered if he could sense the distance between us, if he felt the weight of the secrets I carried. But if he did, he never let it show. The days blurred together, each one much like the last. I threw myself into my chores, trying to keep my mind occupied, but thoughts of Lucas were never far away. I replayed our conversations in my mind, the way he had looked at me, the way his voice had softened when he spoke to me. I thought about the kiss on the porch, the way it had felt both exhilarating and terrifying. And I thought about the guilt that followed, the constant reminder that what we had done was wrong. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I found myself reaching for the letter Lucas had sent me. It had arrived a few days after he left, and I had read it so many times that the paper was beginning to fray at the edges. His words were filled with warmth and longing, a reflection of the connection we had shared. He wrote about how much he missed the farm, how much he missed me. He didn't mention the kiss or the feelings we had confessed, but it was there, between the lines, unspoken but undeniable. Reading his letter brought both comfort and pain. It was a reminder of what we had shared, but also of what we couldn't have. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into its envelope, my heart heavy with conflicting emotions. As the weeks turned into months, I tried to convince myself that life could return to normal. I told myself that what had happened between Lucas and me was a fleeting moment, a summer fling that would fade with time. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The connection we had shared was real, and it had changed me in ways I couldn't ignore. One day, as I was working in the garden, I heard the sound of a car approaching. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment, I allowed myself to hope that it was Lucas. But as the car came into view, I saw that it was Sarah, Lucas's mother. She stepped out of the car with a warm smile, and I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. "Eleanor," she called out, walking toward me. "It's so good to see you." I forced a smile and greeted her, trying to push aside the emotions that threatened to surface. We sat on the porch, sipping tea, and catching up. She talked about Lucas, about how well he was doing in the city, about his plans for the future. I listened, nodding and smiling, but inside, I felt a pang of sadness. It was a reminder of how far apart our worlds were, of how impossible it was for us to be together. After Sarah left, I found myself standing in the garden, staring at the flowers Lucas and I had planted together. They were blooming now, their colors vibrant and full of life. I thought about the moments we had shared, the laughter, the quiet conversations, the unspoken connection that had drawn us together. And I thought about the future, about the choices we had made and the ones we still had to face. I knew that what had happened between us couldn't last. It was a moment in time, a fleeting glimpse of something beautiful and forbidden. But it had also been a reminder of what it felt like to be truly seen, to be truly alive. And for that, I would always be grateful. As the sun set and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, I made a silent promise to myself. I would carry the memory of that summer with me, but I would also let it go. I would return to my life, to the farm, to Thomas. And I would find a way to move forward, even if it meant leaving a part of myself behind. The farmhouse stood as it always had, a silent witness to the secrets it held. The whispers of that summer would forever echo in its halls, a testament to the forbidden love that had briefly bloomed within its walls. And as I stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I knew that I would carry those whispers with me. Always. Time passed, but my thoughts kept returning to Lucas. I tried to focus on my daily tasks, cleaning, gardening, cooking, but his image lingered in my mind. I remembered our conversations, his laughter, his warmth. And every time I thought about what had happened between us, I felt a bittersweet ache, a mix of joy and pain that I couldn't shake. Thomas remained as he always was, quiet, reserved, and absorbed in his work. He didn't notice the change in me, or if he did, he didn't say anything. Our life together continued, but it felt emptier now, as if the brief spark of connection I had found with Lucas had highlighted the void that had been growing between us for years. I tried to bridge the gap, to find moments of closeness with Thomas, but it was difficult. We had grown so accustomed to our routines, to the silence, that it felt almost impossible to break through. One evening, as we sat together on the porch after dinner, I decided to try. "Thomas," I began, my voice hesitant, "do you ever think about how things used to be? When we were younger, I mean." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes," he said after a pause. "But life changes, Eleanor. People change." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my heart ache. I wanted to tell him about the loneliness I felt, about the longing for something more, but I didn't know how. Instead, I nodded and looked out at the fields, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the land. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself growing restless. The farm, once a place of comfort and stability, now felt like a cage. I longed for something, anything, to break the monotony, to make me feel alive again. And then, one day, it happened. I was in the garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of tomatoes, when I heard the sound of a car approaching. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment, I allowed myself to hope that it was Lucas. But as the car came into view, I saw that it was Sarah, Lucas's mother. She stepped out of the car with a warm smile, and I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. "Eleanor," she called out, walking toward me. "It's so good to see you." I forced a smile and greeted her, trying to push aside the emotions that threatened to surface. We sat on the porch, sipping tea and catching up. She talked about Lucas, about how well he was doing in the city, about his plans for the future. I listened, nodding and smiling, but inside, I felt a pang of sadness. It was a reminder of how far apart our worlds were, of how impossible it was for us to be together. After Sarah left, I found myself standing in the garden, staring at the flowers Lucas and I had planted together. They were blooming now, their colors vibrant and full of life. I thought about the moments we had shared, the laughter, the quiet conversations, the unspoken connection that had drawn us together. And I thought about the future, about the choices we had made and the ones we still had to face. I knew that what had happened between us couldn't last. It was a moment in time, a fleeting glimpse of something beautiful and forbidden. But it had also been a reminder of what it felt like to be truly seen, to be truly alive. And for that, I would always be grateful. As the sun set and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, I made a silent promise to myself. I would carry the memory of that summer with me, but I would also let it go. I would return to my life, to the farm, to Thomas. And I would find a way to move forward, even if it meant leaving a part of myself behind. The farmhouse stood as it always had, a silent witness to the secrets it held. The whispers of that summer would forever echo in its halls, a testament to the forbidden love that had briefly bloomed within its walls. And as I stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I knew that I would carry those whispers with me. Always. The seasons turned, as they always did. Autumn painted the farm in fiery hues. Winter cloaked it in silence, and spring breathed life back into the soil. Yet for me, time seemed suspended. The memory of that summer with Lucas lingered like a ghost, haunting the corners of the farmhouse and the recesses of my mind. I had promised myself I would move forward, but some promises are easier made than kept. Thomas and I fell back into our routines, our interactions polite but distant. He spent longer hours in the fields, and I buried myself in tasks, preserving jars of jam, knitting scarves for no one, rearranging shelves that didn't need rearranging. We were two shadows moving through the same space, careful not to collide. Then, one crisp morning in early spring, a letter arrived. Lucas's handwriting on the envelope made my hands tremble. I carried it to the porch, where the sunlight filtered through the oak branches, and stared at it for what felt like an eternity. When I finally opened it, his words were gentle, careful, but they cut through me all the same. Dear Aunt Eleanor, I'm getting married next month. Her name is Clara. She's kind, and she makes me laugh. I thought you should know that I hope you're well. I think of the farm often. I think of you. Lucas, the paper crinkled in my grip as I read it again and again. The finality of it was a dull ache, a door closing I hadn't realized I'd left ajar. I folded the letter neatly, tucked it into the pocket of my apron, and walked to the garden. The tulips we'd planted together were pushing through the soil, their green shoots defiant against the last chill of winter. That night, I dreamt of the pond. We were there again, Lucas and I, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers. But this time, when he kissed me, the water turned to glass, and I saw our reflection, not as we were, but as we might have been. Young, unburdened, free. When I woke, my cheeks were wet. The wedding invitation arrived a week later, cream-colored and embossed with gold. Thomas found it on the kitchen table and frowned. You're not thinking of going, are you? He asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I hesitated. The farm was my world, my sanctuary, and my prison. But something in me, the part that had once dared to feel alive, stirred. I think I should, I said quietly. Thomas studied me, his eyes narrowing as if seeing me for the first time in years. Then he nodded, a single dip of his chin, and returned to mending his boots. The city buzzed with a cacophony of noise and light, a stark contrast to the tranquil rhythm of the farm that I had grown accustomed to. I stood outside the church, clutching my shawl tightly around my shoulders, my heart racing in my chest as if it were trying to break free. When Lucas stepped into the aisle, his eyes found mine in the crowd. For a heartbeat, the world around us stilled, as if time itself had paused to witness our connection. He looked older than I remembered, his features more defined, and his smile had softened, but the warmth in his gaze remained unchanged, a familiar comfort amidst the chaos. Then, just as quickly, he turned his attention to Clara, who was radiant in her delicate lace gown, and in that instant, the moment slipped away, leaving me with a bittersweet ache. I left the celebration before the reception began, slipping away like a shadow retreating into the night. On the train ride home, I pressed my forehead against the cool window, watching as the countryside blurred past in a rush of colors and shapes. The ache in my chest wasn't one of regret. No, it was something deeper, something more profound. It was gratitude, a deep-seated appreciation for a summer that had reminded me of my capacity to feel, to desire, to truly be alive again. When I finally returned home, Thomas was waiting for me on the porch, a steaming cup of tea resting beside him, sending wisps of vapor into the cool evening air. I settled down into the old wooden chair, its creaking a familiar sound under my weight. For what felt like an eternity, we sat in silence, the kind of silence that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. Then, without looking directly at me, he reached over and placed his hand gently on mine. His skin was rough and familiar, a tactile reminder of the years we had shared, and for the first time in decades, it felt like an anchor in a stormy sea. The tulips are blooming, he finally said, breaking the stillness that enveloped us. I followed his gaze to the garden, where bursts of vibrant red and yellow flowers swayed gracefully in the gentle breeze, their colors vivid against the backdrop of the twilight sky. They are, I replied softly, allowing myself to be momentarily lost in their beauty. We didn't speak of Lucas. nor did we need to. Some secrets are best kept in the quiet spaces between words, where they can linger without the weight of explanation. That night, I lit a candle in the farmhouse window, a small but significant beacon against the encroaching darkness. The walls around me held the echoes of decades filled with laughter, tears, and whispered confessions shared in the stillness of night. They held the ghost of a woman who had dared to love fiercely and openly, even if it was only for a fleeting season of her life. I walked to the pond one last time, the moon casting silver ripples across the surface of the water, illuminating the memories that danced just beneath. The past had become a weight I could no longer bear, a burden too heavy to carry any longer. I knelt down, took Lucas's letter from my pocket, and held it close to the flame of my candle. The edges of the paper curled, blackened, and then ultimately dissolved into ash, carried away by the gentle breeze, as if the wind itself were eager to take my memories with it. When I returned to the house, I found Thomas asleep in his chair, a book resting open on his lap, the pages fluttering slightly as he breathed. I draped a soft blanket over him, tucking it around his shoulders, then climbed the stairs to my own bed, feeling the weight of the day slowly lift from my shoulders. The farmhouse settled around me, its familiar whispers fading into the night, wrapping me in a cocoon of warmth and safety. Epilogue: years later, after Thomas was gone and the farm had passed into new hands, I found myself once again standing at the edge of the pond. The water was still, reflecting the sky above, and the willows had grown older, their branches trailing languidly like fingers brushing against the surface of the current. A young couple strolled by, their laughter echoing across the expansive field, a sound that brought a smile to my lips. For a fleeting moment, I saw us, Lucas and me, frozen in that golden summer, filled with hope and dreams, and I couldn't help but smile at the memory. Some loves are not meant to endure the test of time. They are like embers, bright and burning, meant to light the way forward, illuminating the path ahead even as they fade. I turned toward home, the sun warm against my face, and began to walk, each step a reminder of the journey I had taken and the love I had cherished.